Keynote for our lunch presentation is Dr. Nonie Lesaux, who is the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society at the Harvard Graduate School for Education. Dr. Lesaux currently serves as the chair of the Massachusetts Board of Early Education and Care. And keeping with my theme of question, Dr. Lesaux said that her favorite teacher was her 9th grade English teacher, Mr. Notes, because he led them in an exploration of the capture of the rock. So with that, I'd like
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It looks like a wonderful 3 days here on the campus and around a really critical topic, obviously, that touches all of us and is central to my own research and agenda and policy work and programming with communities and school districts. I should just tell you very briefly that my background actually did my training in developmental psychology, focused on problems of schooling in Vancouver, British Columbia, where when I did my training in the mid to late 90s, we had about 35 native languages in the city among the childhood population. And at the same time, Vancouver itself hosts the poorest neighborhood and the wealthiest neighborhood in Canada within miles of each other. And so it makes for a kind of setting where when you're thinking about public health and prevention, science work, and promoting literacy for all, it was an interesting time and it's an interesting place. I did my postdoctoral training in developmental pediatrics there at the BC Children's Hospital, where we were really focused on questions about models of early intervention to be linguistically and culturally sensitive. What does it mean to intervene early? How do we identify delay that's not simply a function of not having the language of the society at the time? So those are the questions that I grappled with in my training, and I've been at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I guess about 14 years. I feel like every year goes faster somehow. I've been there about 14 years, and my work has mostly sort of evolved from a really specific focus on the individual to, not surprisingly, as you sort of heard, this how do we create better opportunities to learn early on at a systems level? How do we think about effective early experiences? How do we think about school districts being a better fit for their population, for example, and particularly in the domains of language and literacy? That's really where a lot of my work lies. So what I wanted to do today was set the stage a little bit, kind of bring you into the world of where we're at with thinking about promoting early literacy, not just in terms of classroom instruction, but more broadly thinking about community-based and state-based work. I'll talk then a little about what that means for in my role as board chair of the Board of Early Education and Care. What I should tell you primarily is that we have never had the kind of momentum we do around early childhood and third grade reading in particular, right? So we haven't seen as much attention ever, I think, across sectors to early childhood, to the notion of birth to 8 pathways, to the notion of cross-sector collaboration. We have the business community now sort of rallied around this idea, et cetera. So lots of activity, as it were, and you see it in the press as well, although obviously not as much these days. With these increased momentum, sort of increased investments and momentum, there's just lots of different services, programs, initiatives that are in some way, shape, or form connected to early learning, connected to early literacy, billing and promising for better third grade reading outcomes and therefore better long range outcomes. So we see the kinds of tactics that we see today are really this notion, for example, of a birth to 8 pathway, which is sort of some lingo that's come up, I would say, in the last decade, We've seen, lots of communities coming together. For example, this initiative here, I should have mentioned, this campaign for grade level reading, which is primarily funded by the Nonie K Foundation in Baltimore. 285 communities sort of coming together regularly to talk about their strategy to sign on to benchmarks. So it's really an interesting time in that sense. And we see, lots more attention to program evaluation, sort of how do we think about evidence-based, that kind of thing. Why third grade? In some respects, rather arbitrary. In other ways, not so arbitrary, which is to say, really, that's kind of the pivot point. If I'm not doing this reading thing well at that point, I'm not doing this schooling thing well, but I'm also not feeling good about myself, to put our sort of psychological hats on, right? I'm just not adjusting well. These are the students who over time we see, pop up in the kinds of statistics that we're not happy about. The peer adjustment, the bullying by the adolescents. We're seeing these individuals, students without sufficient reading skills among those receiving mental health services, among those interfacing with the juvenile justice system, among those in our health clinics as teen mothers, et cetera, right? So that's sort of the public health lens, that we're not talking about literacy for literacy's sake, but we're understanding it as probably the primary vehicle for doing this schooling thing well, right? Over time, we don't teach reading, we just deliver a curriculum, and one needs those reading skills to access it. So we want to think about that, and that's why we think hard about literacy in this case in sort of a public health framework. We also, of course, have today's young children to think about, which is that our poverty rates are on the rise. We have a number of trends demographically, obviously many more children of immigrants. We want to be clear that our fastest growing group in our schools today are children who are US-born children of immigrants, right? So up in our neighborhoods, in our clinics, through our preschools, in our system. Not necessarily majority culture, and I don't say that pejoratively by any stretch. These are also learners who bring with them tremendous diversity, including linguistic diversity. So what's been a little hard for the school system and a little hard for policymakers is these are not native English speakers, though perhaps born here in the US and up through the system, right? So we're going to think about that diversity. We're also pushing on, how are we doing with getting children into high quality early experiences as their families choose? What are our access rates? What is our availability? Across the nation, we're sort of at the 50-60% mark with access and availability for a pre-K experience. The social justice issue is, of course, that the diversity at scale is not playing out as strength, although we know, for example, from a tremendously robust body of research on identity development, on metacognition, on other such constructs, that diversity, particularly linguistic and cultural, ought to be an asset and should be a protective factor and a strength going forward. But as a function of the settings in which many of these students find themselves, they are under-resourced, lower quality. I don't necessarily need to tell all of you in a conference about the achievement gap that we worry a great deal, not so much about the individual, but where the individual lands and the quality of learning opportunities he or she experiences over time. So we have special ed and dropout rates that correlate way too highly with demographics, right? We have special ed rates at 30 and 40% in some urban districts. Special education was meant for 8 to 12% of the population, I don't need to tell you, who have constitutional issues that need intensive work. The equity problem is that on both sides we have a problem, which is special educators are overloaded, overwhelmed, can't possibly deal with those numbers. Therefore, our 8 to 12% who desperately need such an intervention aren't getting it. And at the same time, we have a system that has children tracked to a degree into streams that are just inappropriate. Here in Massachusetts, talked to not too long ago with the commissioner of elementary and secondary. Here in Massachusetts, you perhaps opened your day talking a little bit about this, but we post the widest achievement gap in the country, right? We have the highest performers and the lowest performers. So by virtue of the high performers, we have lots of room for a gap, and we certainly post that gap. And what we can say across the state for a very long time, at least a decade, we have not moved the needle on early literacy at scale by any stretch. And when we stack up the third grade reading proficiency scores by demographics, you can see the story loud and clear, which is that we have very underserved populations. And of course, this is not about ability to learn. It's really about opportunities to learn and what it is that children are, what kinds of experiences they're having. Before we go any further, though, I should say that when we look at these data, for example, on reading proficiency at third grade, where, as a state, we're at about 60% overall. If we break it out by certain groups, we're not even close to 50%. What I should be clear about is there's a number of things happening in this context, which is it's not simply that rates are on the decline per se, but also we should remind ourselves that what counts as literate today is on the rise, which is that to say that we have an economy that now places literacy at the core of most jobs in a way that wasn't the case even 15 years ago. So the labor market economists are going to remind us the trades have been largely eliminated as a function of automation and machines, and the trades that are left are highly specialized and need good literacy, conceptual reasoning, critical thinking skills. So at the same time as we have shifting demographics and communities and districts trying to respond to a different population, we have a labor market that no longer has a place for the 10th grade education or the 8th grade education as a route to a solid adjustment in society and living, if that makes sense to folks. So there's a few things happening here, and we now use information, use literacy and words, and transmit information regularly in a way one could, 20 years ago, avoid print and still have a very solid life and still be very well adjusted and be economically viable. That is has rapidly declined as the case. At the same time, we've got the push for higher education, and the higher education folks are screaming and yelling about the need to do remedial work, right? From the community colleges, which are really experiencing this, but even at the four-year privates, many students having to have some remedial work. In the workplace, just to give you an example, we have the private sector spending a lot of money, for example, on bolstering entry-level workers' literacy skills. What does that look like? Instruction in things like writing a technical memo. How do we write something for the other folks? So sort of lots going on to have us focused not just in schools, but in states and districts and communities across the country on elevating the bar for all students. What I thought I'd do next is just bring you then into the world. This is a vignette that I wrote at one time for some policymakers in DC who were trying to spend a day understanding literacy, not just as reading the words on the page, but what are we talking about when we say a birth to 8 literacy approach, and why babies and why 3-year-olds and why can't the second grade teacher just teach a child to read and we're away to the races. So I thought I'd introduce you to that vignette and then spend some time on some research snapshots, what we're learning, and how we're doing this work on systemic change. So you can meet Nathan and Isabella. Miss Frommer sits on a bright red cushioned chair with a book on her lap and a large and colorful calendar behind her. With her class of kindergartners beginning to gather on the carpet in front of her chair, she waits patiently and smiles. Meanwhile, Nathan finds an open spot close to the teacher and sits cross-legged on the rug.
His heart is racing, but only with excitement. He didn't even feel anxious as he kissed his mother goodbye and entered the classroom all by himself that morning. They had talked about getting ready for kindergarten ever since he was 3 and met weekly with Rebecca, an early intervention specialist who came to the house to sing and play and read with he and his mother. In fact, they would all sit on the floor just like Nathan's class is about to do and talk about books of all kinds. He enjoyed it so much that he and his mother started going to the public library regularly. He loved getting books from there. He put them on a shelf right next to his own special books that his neighbor had given him every now and again. His mom read those books over and over, and Nathan just loved to look at the pictures and pretend to read them to himself. He couldn't wait for Miss Frommer to begin to read. He was feeling very ready for kindergarten. Isabella, in the meantime, sits down on a far corner of the rug. Her heart is racing too. She is so nervous. She had been happy enough playing in the dress-up area while she was trying on the fire hat and red boots, but she has never sat quietly like this with so many children she doesn't know and a teacher up front. She tries to listen to what Miss Frommer is saying. She hears her explaining about the book they're going to read together about September and autumn and something about this season when the temperature gets cooler. What is she talking about? Is she going to tell them what it all means? After a while, she looks around the room instead of listening to what it is Miss Frommer is saying. At this point, Miss Frommer reaches for the book and holds it up in her right hand and asks the class what they think the book is going to be about. Nathan hasn't read the book before, but he sees the picture of a school bus with kids his age on the cover, and his hand shoots up in the air. Isabella thinks he must have read that book at home, and that's how he knows the answer. When Nathan is called on, he says he has never heard the story, but he thinks it's probably about going to school because he knows that the picture on the cover always gives clues about what books are about. And then Miss Frommer asks about the letters that the words on one page start with and how they sound. She talks with another child about how the words mean something about the seasons. Isabella's mind is spinning. She's feeling really left out, and she has lost track of the story. She really wants morning meeting to end. So that's one of those cases where we just lay out the idea that we're not going to get to third grade reading starting at first grade. We're not necessarily going to get there with any one given setting or person, but we're going to think about the accumulation over time, right, of the knowledge, the competencies, the experiences, reminding ourselves that, of course, from 3 to 8, we have this sensitive period in which it's not certainly not deterministic, but one can do better by exploiting the learning opportunities available to them if they've had such learning opportunities the whole way along. And that's what we see with Nathan, right? There's some understanding, there's some familiarity with some of these functions, and he's better able to jump in and take advantage of the learning environment. We could have another conversation about whether we really want morning meeting and everybody to sit still at kindergarten from day one, but that's another conversation. The truth is, that's what's happening out there in many cases. So we don't think necessarily that we're gonna think about Isabella right off the bat as a struggling reader, but we are gonna notice the difference right off the bat in where she is at and where Nathan is at as a function of some of their earlier experiences and the way in which he's able to more quickly take up that learning environment than she is over time. So in all of this work we do, we're thinking about how is it that we get to these high quality experiences for all, and it's going to be across settings. I'm happy, by the way, to give you all this deck and for you to use it as it's helpful to you in your own work with folks. So happy to send it along to Teresa to get to you. But, you know, we think a lot about all of these settings. It used to be that we really thought about reading instruction as a K-3 elementary exercise and activity, and now we're thinking of it as we continue to look at data and learn more about child development and reading in that context. We're thinking about all of the different environments and all of the ways that we can influence the ultimate outcomes that we're looking for everybody. We're also, of course, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today because given the scope of this noon hour talk and your conference and my plan, but we're going to remind ourselves that, of course, it's not literacy in a silo, but, you know, as we develop language and as we are able to better experience the learning environment, Nathan's going to thrive in the social emotional frame. Also, he probably brings with him more language that helps his adjustment with peers, brings more experiences that will drive more social competence. He's likely to get much more positive feedback much more quickly from the adult in that setting, right? He's going to garner more positive attention. And if I were to develop out the case for the purpose of policymakers and those who are working on this, I would develop it out such that Isabella takes a more adversarial stance, right? As her anxiety raises, she's probably going to shut down a little bit. She might come off as negative at times. None of that intended, right? But as a function of being uncomfortable in that learning environment, these are the kinds of behaviors we get. In boys, it's often, aggression over time. So what I thought I'd do as far as sort of thinking that through as the landscape, where we're at, the momentum, how we're thinking about literacy on this path, how we want to be clear about the early childhood sensitive period. What I also next wanted to do was to say, well, what exactly are we learning about literacy itself as the highest lever? What are the findings that matter the most in the context of a conversation about the achievement gap? So I wanted to raise with you two research snapshots, I'm calling them, kind of bring you in and bring you back out into the research and then to what that means for advancing this work at scale. The first research snapshot, we call it the quality-quantity distinction, really about talk. And so many of you will be part of initiatives or have been heard about and read about and are supportive of talk-based initiatives, right? With the idea that we've got this language reading connection, that in many ways the early signs of a good reader is a child with a very well-developed vocabulary. And how do we get to the well-developed vocabulary? We have a lot of experiences out in the world. We learn a lot about the world. We have rich interactions with adults that extend our talk. And eventually we bring that language and knowledge to the page that we're reading, if that makes sense to folks. So this is a great example of why we don't think about this reading thing as a third grade reading thing, but a pathway that started in infancy that really has language at its core. And so, one of the strongest predictors of 10th grade reading comprehension is the nature of one's vocabulary at age 3, right? So we have this, so then we're into this preschool. We have some data for better and for worse that has suggested and did suggest and had a strong effect on policy and practice that we have certain groups of families that are not talking enough with their children. And that became the basis for a lot of initiatives and work. And so the historical and current focus has really been to increase the amount of language that children are exposed to, right? We've been pushing for more input, as it were. So we've had the talk campaigns and the targeted programs, and we've had reach out and read and home visiting and lots of public service announcements. We have a lot of sort of get talking more and here's a book to do it with in a lot of cases, right? And we have been in many respects, we've taken this idea that relationship is demographic, which is to say, as a function of Hart and Risley and others in that research, there's been this sense that the families who are raising children in poverty are not speaking enough as one of the theories of change. The emerging trend in the research that I thought that I would bring to you is that this is really much more complicated, which is to say, not to come off like the unhelpful researcher, but there's a real it depends here, because the emerging research tells us that it's really the kind of language that matters the most, the quality, the type, the nature of the language, not so much the quantity, right, that matters the most, and that in fact, it varies across the income spectrum, that we can find the household in the low-income neighborhood and in the high-income neighborhood and look for the need and look to the need for a different kind of speech. And so it complicates definitely our work around program design and sort of the thinking around this talk piece, because you certainly need sufficient quantity to get to the quality. But what we're finding is that it's not nearly as linear as just more talking. In fact, of course, we might want less talking under a lot of circumstances so that children are producing more speech themselves, right? Same, by the way, in classrooms. In a lot of classrooms, we want teachers to do a lot less talking, turn it over to students for much more exploration and learning. So what do we mean by quality? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that it's sort of, we start where kids are at, we, recall past events together, we advance their language and their knowledge. The exchange sounds much more like a story or an explanation than the directions or the list of questions and answers. And it's that real back and forth. And again, this doesn't, if you put your program design or implementation hat on, it doesn't lend itself easily to the design of the kind of work we've been wanting to do, which is to give sort of brief and practical messages about how to talk more with children. But, in the recent research, just to give you a couple examples of studies, one in our group, the exposure, what we're finding is that it's the type of question, so for example, with 2-year-olds, that's related to their vocabulary growth and verbal reasoning at 3, not at all the quantity of the speech. So if the child was not exposed to the WH questions during that play that we videotaped across time, it was those WH questions, the where, what, why, that turns out to be the challenging input that forces the child to do more reasoning and more talking in the complex sense. Not naming the table or the chair or the blue crayon, but really starting the kind of exchange that we're looking for over time. So we find that, with fathers in low-income settings with their children videotaping their free play, as an example. It's been found at 24 months with mothers, of course. Interestingly, again, no relationship between the quantity of the words during the interaction during the play. Just zeroing in on whether the exchange has those kinds of questions that lead to the exchange between the mother and the child that actually grows their vocabulary across a year. We find the same thing in classroom, in studying classroom settings. In this case, we did a long study in Head Start classrooms. We find there that we're really talking at most of the time, only 10 to 12, 13% of time can be counted as sort of high quality language interactions, in part as a function of the way that they're setting up those programs, but in part as a function of probably the need, if we think back to the prior slide and to this one, for more education around what it is in terms of talk that children need and how do we get there. We find the same thing in 6th grade classrooms. In fact, we find that this is not the easiest finding to message if you think about it from a policy perspective, but we might have 2 6th graders, each in one ELA classroom, one in one ELA classroom, one in another. As a function of the teacher's speech, irrespective of the curriculum, we have children in this class that will grow an extra year that will map onto their reading comprehension because of the kind of academic language that teacher is or is not using regularly. Less speech, more targeted, more sophisticated, right? Why? Because that's the kind of speech that then maps to text. So the children in the young children's studies, the 2-year-olds who are fielding the WH questions from their fathers and mothers and trying their best to respond as 2-year-olds, are the same children who then do better by a storybook, which is necessarily a little more conceptual reasoning, a little more out of the here and the now. Does that make sense to folks? So why is it the quality and not the quantity? Well, it's that we want to think about those quality indicators as actual behavioral and developmental scaffolds, that children are introduced to words and learning the meaning and practicing their use in real time, or you don't answer the question at all, right? So we're thinking of them as more challenging forms of input rather than a lot of the labeling that we tend to do with young children, which is often the case, or asking questions we know they know the answer to, right? In the classroom, what we see is that it's the language that then maps to the curriculum. If I say, Josh, could you distribute these forms rather than pass them out? Could you all sit on the perimeter of the carpet as second graders? Those are the kinds of words that are in text and not in our speech day to day. We don't talk the way we write textbooks, right? And the same is true in these classroom environments. What it suggests, though, is we need to think through how we bridge that gap between the language that is ultimately that of text that I can't handle as a student who's struggling, and how we bridge that gap between that language of that text and the language that I hear and use every day. By that, I do not mean it has to be standard English, because we're going to remind ourselves that in a lot of these households, the higher quality language is going to be the native language. It's not going to be English, right? We want more storytelling, more work with words, more rich talk that is out of the here and the now. So, and then we want to remind ourselves that if parents and educators are doing too much talking that's not targeted, right, and not high quality, then it functions as a stream of speech for students, and they're not picking it up. So the implications, there are a few that we're working with districts and communities and states on. One is engaging in talk campaigns without a strategy for promoting quality is certainly a pitfall at this point, given what we see. And assuming that more talk is needed in many homes and communities, especially low income, is also a pitfall. We're going to have to be a little more sensitive and specific there. And we're going to also remind ourselves that we're not quite there in the early education setting as a high quality language learning environment in a lot of cases. So we're not going to make that assumption. And we're going to think through the messaging challenge and program design challenge, particularly for the 0 to 5 community-based interventions. We've historically seen them as really designed around just more talk. And maybe that's fine foundationally, but as we think about high-risk populations and our work around building adult capacity and caregiver capacity, we're going to have to attend to this in the context of commitment to an achievement gap. So I'm not going to say too much about what it means for practice, but in a way, we've had a traditional practice of starting conversations where children are, what they notice, their interests, their experience. And we're going to kind of bump that up and try to sort of click that up to get a little more out of the here and the now, and starting with the child and bringing them even more into the world, linking those conversations to classroom learning, going back and forth many times. So we do find, we've got a colleague at Vanderbilt who finds it's really almost 5 times we've got to go back and forth for that utterance or that exchange to really drive growth on my side as a child. And if you interact with young children, getting to 5 is no joke. And if it's the teacher who's the only mediator of getting to 5, then we have a real problem, because there are 20 plus children in the room. And if all speech flows back through that adult, it's unsustainable. It means we won't get there with students. So this sort of has begged the question for how we turn more speech over to children, how we get them working together, collaborating together that way to really push them as language learners with, of course, a structure. So that's quality, quantity. I'd be happy to take questions, clarifications before I move on to one other distinction. Good? Go ahead.
It sounds like we're speaking to the notion that in the field of integration concept that a child had in mind. And thank you. Sorry. There's a model developed in Finland for first break psychosis called open dialogue, where it's an interaction that doesn't challenge the psychosis but engages the youth in communication. And it's also implicit in your notion is the idea that language has a purpose, and it's about connection and interaction. I'd like to hear a little bit more about those kind of subconcepts.
So I think you're right. Language as tool, right? Language learning for language's sake, right? Getting not just read the book to do better in school, but start with the language, build up language as a tool. How am I communicating, etc. Remind ourselves, this is maybe the bridge to your other comment, remind ourselves that as we do really good, high quality language promotion work, we are developing social emotional skills, because a lot of that work with young children is going to be around emotions, around conflict. We're talking it through, we're understanding what happened out on the playground, we're talking it through in a meeting or some format with other peers. Those are all abstract emotion words, perspective taking, etc. With our older students, perspective taking is one of the strongest comprehensions of strongest predictors of reading comprehension, right? Because if I do well with narrative, it's partly that I can get into the minds of others. I can understand where others are coming from. I might be able to better understand the author's perspective, etc. So I think where the tie is yes, language is tool and I own it, and we start to work as a classroom community in the early ed and elementary settings, as a classroom community on our language, not just to breeze through it to get to the curriculum, but to really develop language, capital L. And in so doing, when we do that well, we're out of the here and the now and we're into the abstract. We do it well with, first, we've got to have good things to talk about, and good things to talk about that demand 5 plus back and forth means that we start with a theme or a topic or a unit of study, and we've got several books and we're digging into something, right? And we've got some key concepts and ideas. So at some point in this conference, you'll hear more about some of the work in Boston, I'm sure. But a big piece of the Boston early childhood approach has been to turn 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds into scientists and social scientists in the classroom in completely developmentally appropriate ways. But we've got to increase the cognitive press. We've got to expect more, really feed the little brains and get them much more engaged. And getting the cognitive press up with young kids also means turning it over to them, right? So morning meeting might be okay for 10 minutes, but it's got to be the kickoff to something that's mind and body and exciting, and over time, we're studying something, right? We're becoming experts. We're using different pieces of information, different media. Does that help? On the code meaning distinction, it's the other side of the coin that I want to talk about, which is this reading thing. And we talk about literacy and reading like it's one construct, but I really want to call out two sides of that coin as central to a problem that has to be remedied if we're going to get there with all our populations. So if you look at this piece of third grade text, to get through this piece, what we would say is there are at least 2 skill areas, code and meaning, to get through there. And on the code side, it's really my mechanics. I know how to read the words on the page. I know how to sound out shark and read it as a word. I know that there's a difference between their, T-H-E-R-E, and their, possessive. I, as a reader in third grade, need to read this passage at about 100 words correct per minute in order to then have this sort of cognitive space left over to make meaning while I'm reading. So if we all think of ourselves kind of drifting off with an article in our hand, we get to the end, we've got to go back to the beginning because there was too much time elapsed from top to bottom to really work with the content. The content side is really the meaning-based side. It's having the cognitive strategies that we have to know when we've understood something or not, to notice something we don't understand. It's bringing enough background knowledge and vocabulary to the passage. That's what we do as good readers. You need about 80% familiarity with something to learn from text. So with any passage or book, you need to have majority of the content needs to be very familiar to build it then take some new learning and build that into your cognitive schema. You got to have the interest and motivation in the language. And I would argue that the motivation and interest largely depends upon my skill proficiency. So we've had this prevailing, one prevailing camp is find something kids are interested in as a starting place and they will do better. And I would argue maybe that's a good strategy, but not if they don't have the skills to do the reading in the first place. And the way one broadens out their mind is to read about things that they don't know if they're interested in or not, right? So there's a certain tautology if we stay in this idea that it's just about interest and motivation. All right, so the code is really the mechanics. The meaning making is really the broader, how do I understand this passage or this book in the context of my own knowledge? The distinction I make is because at the code and meaning level within reader, we have a lot of kids who are really well developed on one side and not the other. And it's this. We have a lot of students who have really well developed code skills and whose meaning making is just not there, right? And that's the treating reading like it's about reading the words on the page. There's 26 letters and 44 sounds, and we have a science of instruction to teach all of us how to decode words. That's what we do. The downside here is that we have not nearly the explicit, intensive instruction happening on the meaning-making side. That's the cognitive press. That's the work on language. That's the work on learning about the world. So we're sending off in this NICHD 10-year study, we're sending these kids off, recruited from Head Start at age 4. We're sending them off to high school, having gone up through the system, able to read the words on the page, but have a comprehension score at the 20th percentile, 20th, end of middle school. Statistically, the odds are against them to finish high school. It's just very unlikely to be able to handle the language demands of the curriculum with vocabulary and comprehension levels at the 20th percentile. So if you wanted to force yourself into this profile, then you'd find yourself a graduate level course in something that you have absolutely no background knowledge in and terminology for. And you go to that class and you read the words on the page and you are not working at grade level, but you're reading print. Does that make sense to folks? So this has real policy implications, because many of these students here qualify for special education with that profile. Special education was never meant for them. If you look at the growth rates, they're tiny here. Our sample's growth rate was twice that of the national average, but it probably needed to be 3 or 4 times that to make up the gap that they came in with on the vocabulary side. Does that make sense to folks? But this is not a learning problem, this is a fit problem, which is that they need something much more intensive over time to get to the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. And it's not just going to be early, it's going to be sustained instruction through the years as the curriculum itself changes and advances with respect to the cognitive press and the language. When we do this work and look at that profile for English only versus English language learners, we get much, in the urban high-risk setting, we get much more similarity than difference, which is to say both groups need a lot more work of this kind, right? So we're really thinking about prevention efforts. On the text side, we're going to remind ourselves that the game changes over time and that you could be proficient at 1st grade and not proficient at 5th grade by virtue of the change in the text demands over time. So what makes this text especially challenging is that by 10th grade, it's using really complex language that we don't use in the everyday. We just don't speak the way the textbooks are written. They have a lot of academic words that also find themselves into the newspapers, but we're not using metaphors and drawing analogies and using all kind of academic words when we speak. So we're going to remind ourselves that the author's role is to pack a lot of information into text, to be really informative, to be really precise. We're not going to repeat ourselves. There's a lot we do in speech that we don't do in text. The other thing I want to remind us is that, when we talk about word learning, it's not an all or nothing kind of thing. There's lots of us who have some knowledge of many words that we don't then use in our speech and writing. So we're at sort of a stage 3, whereas what we're really shooting for is our students to have a really strong, well-developed grasp of the concept that underlies a lot of their words that they're coming across. So that's sort of the level 5. But what I don't want to do is convey with the graph before that these are students without language. That's not it at all. They've got labels, not always concepts, right? They've been through school, they've been exposed, they're just not getting deep enough instruction to really push the conceptual knowledge, which means that you're working with labels and not really the conceptual knowledge, such that when you come across a metaphor or a simile or any way that the word is used conceptually, it doesn't work out. So on the code meaning distinction, we remind ourselves that we have a constrained, sort of mastery-oriented approach, right? We can bound this. It's instructional. It can happen easily from K to 3 for most learners. On the meaning-based side, we've got language and knowledge that's ever evolving, that needs to develop from infancy through adulthood. And that means sustained instruction through adolescence from the earliest years. In our schools, what this means is that we're pushing for a much more robust instructional model. We have way too many readers being identified for intervention and special ed services, and many readers' needs can't be effectively addressed through those interventions, right? If you think about what they really need, what we're talking about is language and knowledge. And there's too many interventions in play for effective implementation and coordinated efforts. So when we do this work with districts, we're really talking about, the kind of unit-based, thematically based, rigorous reading instruction that you would expect from the earliest years all the way up through. So let me just say a few things about moving to impact and what that means for how we think about policy and programming and where we're at. And I'm going to just suggest and leave you with one framework that we've been working with across the country on sort of how we move the needle on literacy improvement. And what I wanted to talk for a minute about is the program design and implementation for impact bucket here, which is to say, if you look at this model, you're not surprised by it, except maybe by the first bucket. In much of the literacy work for decades has really found its way into conversations about assessment, about how we're going to do better by the adults, about the curricula we're using, about what good family engagement and community partnerships look like. When we put this framework forth several years ago, we started first with a bucket about program design and implementation for impact, with the idea that if we don't get that right, the rest of it actually doesn't work out very well. So what do I mean by that? Well, we haven't had a long history of looking to implementation science or program design work in this area. What I mean is this is a field that has, and from the community-based work through to the districts, has really talked about programs and services in light of the child outcomes. And what we haven't been in the business of doing is asking ourselves, what is it about the program or the service that is influencing the behaviors, which are ultimately based on relationships and interactions, to go back to your question a little bit. So where we've been focused on our work with communities and schools and states and districts is, for example, you can have all kinds, you could come up with a laundry list of programs or services that count themselves among the many that are working on improving literacy outcomes through, from the traditional through to the more not totally directly mapped onto reading instruction by any stretch, but our home visiting or our early intervention, all important on the route to third grade outcomes. And what we want to be clear about is what we're not doing is attending to exactly what it is that that program is meant to do and how we're implementing it to drive the change. So if we look carefully, at the implementation data for a lot of programs today, we're mostly at about the 40% fidelity rate on a lot of these community-based kinds of programs, right? At the same time, if we look carefully at the design, we have many, many goals for them as individual programs, and we don't nearly have an articulated purpose, express purpose. Most programs are going to do one thing well, probably just one thing. If we go back to the code meaning quality quantity, that is really about implementation and design to get to interactions and relationships that are much stronger. So, and as we do that, right, we have this reciprocity, which is that if we get the toddler speaking more and working more with books, they're also inciting those behaviors among adults. So we've been working hard on this notion of trying to get those 285 communities, for example, signed on to the campaign for grade level reading, working hard on this issue of what exactly, which aspect are we working on, and how have we supported the adults, and is it high touch enough to get us to our stated outcomes? So all too often right now in this field, we have a disconnect between what we've invested in and what we're expecting, right? So we often use this kind of continuum, which is that there's a continuum of programs and services from raising awareness to changing behaviors. And what we want to be clear about is as we move towards talking about changing behaviors, we need more time, money, human capital. It needs to be more intense. The third pitfall that I wanted to share that builds closely on this, getting this relationship right from program to outcome, is that we're still talking a lot about outputs instead of outcomes when we talk about successes. And when we talk about a program and its efficacy, we are still all too often talking about the outputs, not the outcomes. And it's not to say that every program needs to turn into a program, have a program evaluation arm. But we need to do better by these children and families who are participating to know exactly what it is we're targeting, what our implementation rates are, and do we see the changes in behaviors and competencies, whatever it is that we're working on. And that's really, in some respects, we've got to get clearer and sharper if we've got this landscape that's pretty peppered with a lot of activity, right? A lot of programs. Boston is a great example of a city with a whole lot of resources and programs and initiatives. And there comes a point where to do the kind of strategic coordination we want to do, we also need to back it up and articulate where does this fit on the map for children and families? What exactly are we targeting? And what's the purchase in terms of the outcome that we're looking for? What we see in a lot of states and communities and districts is a tendency to want to continue to add programs and respond to limited success by adding, as opposed to getting at the underlying issue, which all too often is really about implementation. For whom and under what conditions? Many of them are working, but not for everybody, and not with the blanket approach that we often take. So just to leave you with a case example, sort of campaign A case example, this is an example of a community that signed on to move the needle on third grade reading, and has the kind of population you would expect demographically, lots of partners involved, right? Just launched this Birth to 8 campaign, early educators, pediatricians, home visitors, United Way, Family Foundation, etc. When we map their programs and think about what's next, or what's the roadmap, what's the messaging campaign, you can see that in a lot of these communities we land on the raising awareness side, which is to say the dosage, the intensity is just not there to get us to where we want to. And it's not to say, obviously, singing to the choir, in a prevention model we need some tier one, some awareness raising, but The disconnect that we're seeing in the context of a conversation about the achievement gap is that we're actually expecting pretty lofty outcomes from programs that actually, in many ways, would be characterized as awareness raising. They're just too light touch. And that's the thread that kind of runs through this conversation today, because our talk campaigns are going to have to become much more intensive, which is to say they're going to be adult capacity building models over time, right? The code meaning is we've figured out how to teach the mechanics. We're not yet there on the intensive, explicit work to get to the language and knowledge building. And, with time, we're going to need also to find out what it is that's working and not working, not at large, but for whom and under which conditions, so that we're not in this cycle of new programs and adding, but we're going deeper on what we already have. So I think I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take some questions from folks. And I'll just leave you with that summary slide. Go ahead. Yes, of course.
Hi, my name is Seema, and I'm a graduating student from HMS.
Great.
So my question is, we focused on a lot of the quality, and in the end of it, you talked about access to early education. And I just want to raise the awareness that the access is a huge issue right now. Because as a mother of 3, I'm looking into early education right now. And apparently in the state of Massachusetts, if you're not on cash assistance, you aren't, that is the only way to get a voucher. And to get a cash assistance, for example, my husband and I are both students, and our total loan considered as our income is about $18K.
Yeah.
But that's not low enough to be considered to get a voucher. There is Head Start programs. However, we applied to 3 different Head Start programs, and they're all full at this point. Then our next option is basically whatever is out there, and it's $25K a year to put our 3-year-old in early education. And the thing is, I know a lot of policies going on, as your craft demonstrated, on implementation for impact as the first step, but the access piece is really a huge issue right now. And I was wondering, from a policy-making standpoint, what else can we do?
Yeah. So here's where I can tell you where Massachusetts is on that question, or on this sort of quality access discussion. So first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. We don't have access to high quality, affordable childcare, right? We want it to be high quality, and we want it to be affordable. And this is not a country that has a long history of doing that for families. As a Canadian coming into this role of board chair, what I can say is that there was a long wave of making the case for the investment in early ed as this long run outcome, right? What's sort of been tricky about that work over time is that we haven't really gotten the data. We don't really have local data on the purchase of early education and care, and we have a lot of quality rating data that would suggest it's not at all high quality at scale. So when I stepped into the board role 18 months ago, there had been a decision already, which I supported, to move the needle on quality in a short period of time to generate some statistics that would help make a stronger case for more access to high quality. And that's really where the field sits right now, nationwide and here. It is, in some respects, easier to sell access to legislators for the state budget, for example. The issue is that the data that's out there publicly is that this is not high quality, so I'm not purchasing high quality. So there's a tension and a bit of a tautology there that we're trying to work on. And we're working on it via quality improvement, which is mental health consultation in and out of centers, both at the adult and the child level, for example, coaching, etc. But I hear you, and I don't have a quick answer to the fact that Massachusetts, like many other states, doesn't have nearly enough slots. They also don't have nearly enough slots that you would be happy with. And that's the issue in many respects. A lot of that is about the workforce. And so a lot of our quality work is on really building up a better pipeline for a stronger workforce to get to the quality outcomes. Yeah.
So, Nefertiti Durant, I'm adolescent medicine at the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Mm-hmm.
So one of our issues, there are lots of programs for 0 to 5 that are state-based and nationally, and then there's a lot of you are probably familiar with Reach Out and Read. My issue is, what do you do after that? So I know one of your slides said 0 to 9 and further.
Mm-hmm.
And you do see that gap where kids can read, but are they understanding what they read? And we see the other end where kids are coming in and they're telling me that they're getting A's in school,
Yeah.
but then they go and they take the ACT,
Yeah.
and their score is
Right.
not reflecting their GPA.
Mm-hmm.
And so many times I thought about writing grants to get a Reach Out and Read type of program in the clinic, but trying to think about the justification for that type of program and whether people would actually buy into that. And so just your thoughts about, well, are there programs out there for teenagers or later kids about just sort of sustaining that interest of building reading skills after 5?
And more eyes on print, in the
Right.
middle childhood, early adolescence. There's a few things to say. One is, as advocates, we need to be all over those school districts that are producing readers with A's who then can't do well on the ACT, right? I mean, that's the first fiction that needs to go. I should tell you that the 300 families in that longitudinal study, when we did our qualitative analysis interviews with parents, not one of those parents had a good sense that their child was not even close to set up for high school. Why? We don't hear from the school. Behavior seems good. Does their homework every night, right? Indicators like that. So that's the first thing. But the more pragmatic response is really about out of school time and the extent to which you have YMCAs and other types of organizations, Boys and Girls Club. That's been one key lever in some of this work, is to turn those programs not into an extension of school per se, but to go after real enrichment, right? If we got them doing thematic kind of work, for example, for 2 and 3 weeks, or some kind of unit of study that involves some work in the community and some reading at night, and they're moving it along in a couple hours after school, we've had some success there. Those are also learners who need good summer programs, right? Those are learners who are likely dipping every summer, likely some decline in their literacy skills from spring to fall, and who need not remedial sort of negative, you're tagged with more school because you're not there, but who not take the middle income model and try to reproduce it at the community level with high risk learners. It's sort of summer camp like, right, that involves print and sort of getting to know certain topics or themes. It involves being out in the community. It involves more intentional language, etc. On the clinic side, I think I'm not aware of anything, an analog to Reach Out and Read at the middle childhood, early adolescence stage, but it's certainly not out of the question to think about where are the touch points between those families and kids in the community. Where are some of the touch points, and how could we set up some out-of-school reading programs there too? Yeah. But what comes to mind for me is the out-of-school and after-school and summer, for sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure where this fits in, but so I run a foundation, the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health down in Texas. We're part of UT Austin. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we have to do is create communication tools to reach out to, stakeholders, but also obviously to the average individual. And it seems to me that when it comes to literacy is declining in this country. And here's my take on it. 10 years ago, my communications manager told me we need to write our brochure, so a 6th grade reading level comprehension. Now my communications manager came back to me today. She just came back from a communications conference, and they're being told 4th grade. So in 1 decade, it went from 6 to 4. So,
or it's an attention span, which is we got to write it quicker and shorter.
oh,
and
that's in
easier.
there too. Social
Yeah.
media, it can't be longer than, X number of characters. But my point being, the issues that we're dealing with at Hog Foundation for mental health
Yeah.
are very complex issues, and this is not the average American room. So how are we to make that connection, given the research and taking it to translation, and to ensure that, in fact, we're actually raising the literacy level of the United States? Because I'm seeing the opposite, or maybe it's just Texas. And I'm good with that too, because Texas, well, I'll leave it at that.
So here's the thing. Some of what, you raise a very large kind of conceptual issue. I mean, what I can say with certainty is that the literacy skills among the population have actually not declined if you do the 50-year analysis with the tests. What has changed is the role of literacy in society and in the labor market especially. And then what you might also be picking up from your communications folks is remember that we have much more linguistic diversity, right? And so to the extent that we're trying to now think through how are we more universal with our communications, because we as a society have chosen English, obviously, but not everybody has English literacy levels. So I think that's in part what the communications folks are responding to also. What I can say overall is it is an adult capacity. We do need to think through adult capacity to do this job, whether you're the parent, caregiver, community-based caregiver, early educator, elementary teacher. Have we equipped the adults with the language, the tools, the knowledge? And I think the answer in many ways is no. We haven't kept pace with training and professional learning. And to go back to my earlier point, I think we have a ton of initiatives, and they're not nearly intensive and sustained enough to make the kind of difference that we're looking for. So it's the unfortunate answer of, more deep work over time, including in school districts, less coverage, more instruction deeply on fewer topics to build up knowledge, if I were to get into the district level issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. To piggyback on Dr. Egan's question about how this fits in terms of the political climate, you're speaking about reading, understanding, but also alluding to thinking, and about teaching our children to think. Our country doesn't seem to have enough thinkers.
In the public eye.
In general. I mean, we have people surviving who are caught in these torrents of technological changes, who are grabbing onto whatever they can because things are changing so quickly they don't know what's going to happen next. Those with the least skills that you talked about, the reading skills that are needed to do the work, are the ones that feel the most left behind, and they often react in fear. And we have policymakers that either fan that fear or turn that fear into fear of others. And I don't hear enough people thinking about how do we get ready. And what you just said, it can't just be the schools. It has to be the community.
Yeah, it's a systemic
Yes,
approach.
there's this, and it's not just happening in the United States, it's happening all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't have sort of answers to this, but I can observe that if I wanted to be pragmatic about it, I would say our funding cycles and our policymaking cycles are too short, right? And to go back to the earlier slide, we go heavy with an investment, but we still set an outcome that's completely unrealistic in developmental terms, right? So we asked the 6-week summer program to boost literacy scores by 1 or 2 grade levels, just as an example. Or we asked we put a lot of money into a community health center, but the the proxies or the benchmarks that we're naming are likely to set us up for disappointment, or worse, a sense that it didn't work. But our measurement was off. So I agree that the bigger picture comes off as thinking, but the lack of clear articulation of the theory of change, is adding to this idea that nothing works and we've got to look for something new and churn and churn and churn, right? When, many of our initiatives are going to take 2 and 3 years to get to a place where the measurement would actually shed light on the kinds of gains that we're looking for. And I don't see funding cycles and policy-making cycles that are long enough. But I take your point seriously, too, that there's this larger sort of fast-paced kind of thing happening.
Last question.
Sure.
So getting at your last point about you don't see funding for the type of access
Right.
and resources that
Right.
children need to improve their literacy. Can you talk a little bit more about changes in curriculum? So for
Sure.
instance, you talked a little bit about the morning meeting and how that could be restructured. A couple of years ago, I first heard about a concept of flipping the classroom. And I'm curious, flipping the classroom being that students
right.
Go home and watch a video, and when they come to school, the teacher has more time for individual instruction for students who are struggling. Talk a little bit about how school districts change their curriculum and the acceptance or reticence to do that when a lot of funding may be based on testing strategies and things of that nature.
Right. So, ironically, the kind of deep work that we're suggesting actually gets you to better gains, longer run. But you need a systemic approach, which is to say, it's true that if you don't have a good systemic approach, then tutoring the third graders a month before the test is probably going to be your best bet at some level. Not that I'm suggesting that's anything developmentally sensitive. So here's the thing about the reading instruction and the curriculum. First is, you're right that the pedagogy, to get to the language learning inquiry-like environment that we're looking for with real structure and intentionality and intensity, right? Not so loose that we don't have learning objectives and we don't know where we're going and we don't have benchmarks, but the delivery and the format involves much more peer-centered, peer-focused learning, which is to say, and much more discussion-based response and discussion for reasoning purposes and to extend your knowledge. So concretely, the change that just has to happen in more districts is we have to infuse much more rich content into the earliest years, which is to say a lot of our children, kindergarten to third grade, these are not content-rich classroom learning environments. Same goes for early education also. These are not places we've thought of as having knowledge objectives for kids to build up their knowledge of things. We thought about the reading instruction as in terms of the code for the mechanics. So we use the print to deliver that instruction. But the print that I'm going to read to learn how to read is not the same print that's going to teach me how to think and how to learn about how you learn, because I can't read it. It's too complex. So concretely in a first or second grade classroom, what does the really strong literacy instruction look like? It looks like a 4-week unit of study on a big idea or a topic, climate change. I mean, pick your topic. Could be climate change with 5-year-olds. It's not out of the question to find the right books to get to a place where in the run of a day, we do some circle time about that topic or the aspect that we're studying that week. We then move out into our stations and do application, and we're working with our minds and our bodies, and our art and our science connects. And out on the playground, we're out there intentionally. Maybe we're looking at leaves, maybe we're looking for signs of climate change. I don't know, I'm making it up as I go right now. But it's all connected around a concept. And we're studying. That's what we do in this classroom in the 4 weeks. And over the course of 4 weeks, I'm also working on a project with my peers. And this is alive and well in Boston, and the results are very promising. So you turn it into a very child-centric learning environment, make no mistake. It's not more traditional schooling, that's not it. but it has all kinds of rich content at its core. Really strong read-alouds of text that those children could never read on their own or comprehend. And we do that work with those texts repeatedly, right? You got to read them a few times over the course of several weeks to really draw out different aspects, discuss. We have classrooms where we're using language protocols, which is to say we know when we go off into this group as 6-year-olds that first John is going to be the facilitator and the note taker, and Jimmy's going to keep time, and then we're going to all go around and answer a question and talk to each other, right? Because we're going to have to get kids talking to one another about this topic, and then we're going to come back to the larger group and report back. If you take some of the principles of really high quality education for teenagers and young adults and bring it down, or you take really high quality early ed and bring it up for high schoolers, it's sort of that kind of thing. But it is, you're right to kind of go to this flipped classroom, which is how can I as a teacher become a facilitator of learning rather than a deliverer of information? Yeah. And we're going to have to do away with a lot of the worksheets. And I don't say that politically, but this can't be rote like work, except when we're teaching rote skills like learning 26 letters and 44 sounds.
Just as a quick follow-up, do teachers associations, are they advocating for this?
They're getting there. What's hard is it's gonna be a real push on professional learning. So Boston's success is the combination of a curriculum and intensive coaching in classrooms for teachers. So there's two tools. One is the high quality curriculum to begin with. I need 180 days of plans. I need those 4-week units. I need all of the text so I can focus on delivering my instruction as a teacher or facilitating the learning. In a lot of districts, we still don't have good curricula, right? We have teachers pulling from here and pulling from there and trying to cobble it together. The second is, as I get to know this curriculum and my learners, I need a lot of coaching and support. So it's a different strategy. And again, it kind of goes back to that continuum, which is it's just necessarily more resource intensive, but it's a long run investment because those teachers over time, that's a different human capital, right? That's different human capital. Those are teachers who now know how to deliver really content rich instruction in very developmentally appropriate ways with high risk populations.